morning. Welcome to Ripon Community Church. My name is Sam. I'm one of the pastors here. As Meg said earlier, I made the first service do calisthenics because they were so sleepy, because it's overcast outside. We love the rain, but the overcast, I think, makes us a little sleepy. Do you need calisthenics? Okay, I'll let you pass this time. For those of you watching online, we're glad to have you guys this morning. If you came for the first time this morning, if you're visiting us, you came on a fantastic Sunday to be here because we're kicking off a brand new series called Build It Well. We're looking through the book of Nehemiah, seeing all these ways that there are God-given principles for how to build something well. But it's actually quite fitting for us, actually, because we're doing this crazy thing of remodeling a building, like just a couple miles away, next like a mile and a half away down the road. That's all in process right now, so the fact that that's happening while we talk about this is pretty awesome to talk about those parallels. But Nehemiah, the book Nehemiah, is about more than building walls. At its core is this thing that it's about building something that's worth protecting, building something of significant value. I mean, we're all building something. We're all building a home. We're all building a family. We're building a business, a career. We're building an education, a program, a team, a dream team. We're building all kinds of different things as we're going through this life. And there's so much that goes into doing that well. In this first week, we're going to focus on potentially the most critical part of the building process. It's the thing you absolutely need if you're going to build something well. It's the thing you need to return to over and over and over again if what you're building is going to stay true to its purpose, to its original purpose. So, what is that thing that you need? You're going to have to wait. We'll get to it in a second. We'll get to it soon. But before we get to it, though, we have to actually lay some groundwork. In order to grasp this story really well and get everything that we can from it, we need to give ourselves some context. We need to lay the groundwork. So this summer series of Nehemiah, in order to understand it, we're going to need to step into this scene. We need to describe the scene that we're stepping into. And so let's do that. Let's set the scene for ourselves today. Nehemiah, the book, it's in a context where Jerusalem, the city Jerusalem, the one that's still there today, Jerusalem was considered by all Jews to be a holy city. It still is today, but it was especially so then. It was the location where the temple was, which was literally the spot where heaven and earth intersected by Jewish tradition and understanding of faith. That was the spot where God met with his people. So it was special in that way. It was also the place where their greatest king, King David, had ruled from. But because many of Israel's kings and many of Israel's people, the Jewish nation, had disobeyed God, had decided to follow other gods, had not listened to the prophets who said, turn back to God or else, something happened. And what happened was an entire nation was exiled all over the known world at that time by the kingdom of Babylon. And so they're literally taken to the ends of the earth. They were exiled to the far corners of the Babylonian Empire with just a few people left behind to take care of this all-important city, Jerusalem. So, most people, they're exiled. Another nation is ruling over them. There's another king that's not from the Jewish nation. And you know what happens when we don't repair roads? You know what I'm talking about? Like when the streets end up looking like this. Like, have you seen this in Ripon before? Like, have you driven down streets and felt like this is what you're driving over, potholes? Anybody driven over a pothole on the way here this morning? Right? Like they're everywhere. Now imagine a city without people to repair the roads. And add to that, hostile countries, hostile nations all around them wanting the city flattened with hardly anyone there to fend them off. That's the quick version of the scene that we're walking into with the Bible book of Nehemiah. And it starts with this. Nehemiah, he's one of the exiled Jews. He had found himself working in the king's court, way up high in the king's court. And over time, he finds himself meeting with one of his brothers, his brother Hanani, who had come to visit. And like you do, like you meet some old friends, some old family, you catch up, you say, hey, how are things getting along? How's the family? What's it like back home in Jerusalem? How are things going? And this is the response. Nehemiah describes the response he got with this. He says, they said to me, things are not going well for those who return to the province of Judah. They are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem has been torn down, and the gates have been destroyed by fire. Now, this news was crushing for Nehemiah. This home, that's home. The place where God meets with his people, his beloved city, the walls in shambles, the city defenseless. And worse than potholes, this is the call from the friend who was hit by life really hard, and they're desperate for help. This is the natural disaster that ravages your hometown. This is the call you get in the middle of the night that changes everything. And Nehemiah, he's human, so he has a very human reaction, one that all of us should expect when we receive news like this. This is what happens next. It says, when I heard this, I sat down and wept. In fact, for days I mourned, fasted, and prayed to the God of heaven. You can imagine what's going through his head. I mean, he can see it. Like, you can guess what images are flashing before his eyes that he just can't get out of this head, right? The walls in shambles, the city gate torched by fire, the city that he loves defenseless, and enemies striding on in without anybody defending it. I mean, have you ever had that thing? Have you ever had that thing that you just can't look away from? That thing that eats at you? The thing that you know deep in your gut, you can't rest until you do something about it. I mean, it could be a big thing, it could be a small thing, but you know you have to do something. A couple years back, we had this, we're in a crazy different world, it feels like, 2 years ago. But I went to the doctor's office with one of my sons. It was my turn to take one of the kids to the doctor, and so we were there. And this was right when COVID was still like a thing. And the news stories were hitting the headlines like, hey, there's a shortage of nurses, things are a struggle, they're working too many hours, short-staffed, all that stuff. So I sat there with my son at the doctor's office, and I asked the doctor, just, hey, how are things going? And it was really interesting because she responded back and said she was doing okay, like she was managing, doing well, but what was really hard was nurses. I mean, they were stretched. Like, they were exhausted. They were working too many hours. They were pushing too hard. They were seeing hard things. And I remember how, like, it hurt her. Like, it was tough for her to see that. And I remember leaving that day and thinking to myself, man, this stinks. Like, here we are in America. We have to be able to do something about that. There's got to be something we can do. And I remember just not being able to get it off my mind. That's it. And maybe you felt like that before. And that's the thing. The most critical part of the process of building something well, anything that has a good, lasting, critical impact on the world in our on the world or in our life, it always stems from a moment like that. Like when Nehemiah sat down and wept. That moment when there's just something from which you just can't look away from. You just can't look away. When something hits you like that, there's power there. There's a willingness to do whatever it takes to just do something about the problem. You maybe aren't going to solve it, but you got to do something. It's when you get to that moment of being able to say, I'm not okay with doing nothing. You need this moment if you're ever going to build something well. Maybe you've had that before. And so maybe you've had that moment and you're experiencing that moment. You know what that's like. So imagine you're in that spot right now with me. And there's this feeling in your gut, the sense of justice. This thing just isn't right. And God put that inside of you. What now? What do you do next? How do you get some traction? How do you not just stare at the problem? How do you do something about the problem? I'm convinced that the best thing that you can do, the best place to begin taking action is actually a place where from the outside it will appear as if you're doing nothing. The best place to take action is how Nehemiah starts. The very next thing Nehemiah does, how he begins to take action, is through prayer. He begins by confessing that his people and himself have sinned against God and they've gone off, like they'd received the natural consequences, been exiled to the corners of the earth, and that's just how things were. So he confesses that to God, but then he reminds God of something. And you can use this, guys. This is real. Like he reminds God of a promise that God had made. It's not that God forgot, but he's calling God out on it. He says to God, check this out. It says, God, you said, but if you return to me and obey my commands and live by them, then even if you are exiled to the ends of the earth, I will bring you back to the place I have chosen for my name to be honored. The people you rescued by your great power and strong hand are your servants. O Lord, please hear my prayer. Listen to the prayers of those of us who delight in honoring you. Please grant me success today by making the king favorable to me. Put it into his heart to be kind to me. In those days, I was the king's cupbearer. Now hear this. Prayer is not a parlor trick. It doesn't work like that. It doesn't magically make people do what you want them to do. But you know what prayer does do? Prayer has this way of humbling us. It asks God to do some work, and it sees then also how God is already at work. And in that action of being humbled, we're aligned with what God wants. You know that feeling of justice that you feel? That desire for justice? And that was put there by God. God put that inside of you. God designed you with that. When we pray, it's a form of digging and mining for what matters most to God. Then it's trusting that God will provide a way for you to be part of that, for you to be active in that. Prayer is this two-way initiative or invitation. It invites God to work. It also invites God to move inside of you, leading you to do what only you can do. If you've ever thought to yourself, like, man, who am I? Like, I can't do anything. What difference can someone like me make? If you've ever experienced that, like you've thought about things like that, just know that in the Bible is filled, it's chock full with examples of people who use their small few resources to allow God to use them to do incredible things. And God can do amazing things with just these small jumps of faith. Sometimes it's the smallest thing that has the biggest impact. I was thinking about this last week. I got this video to show you. Check this out. This, I think, illustrates it pretty well. So here's this guy out on a snowboard. He's going to go snowboarding down the mountain, which, by the way, who wants to go do that? That sounds fun. Looks pretty great. But right, like he's going on a snowboard. That's pretty fun. He's going to go down there. And then all of a sudden, he does this thing. He does this little quick turn like this, right? All of a sudden, and then that happens. Yeah. And just so you know, he makes it. He's okay. But it's an avalanche. Sometimes we don't even begin to realize how much one small action, one small jump can have a cascading effect with so much power it is overwhelming. Nehemiah had done the praying. He knew that God wanted him to move, to protect his city. So he jumped, he made the leap. He goes to the king because he can. He has access to the king. He's the cupbearer, the guy who makes sure that the king doesn't get poisoned. It's a pretty important rule. It matters. So he has that position, and it's a pretty high up job, and he uses what he has access to. And it's a jump because it's risky. It's incredibly risky. The king has no reason to help him, and to be a potential annoyance to the king, that's to risk your life. So here's what happened, and I love this book because it's actually written in first person. They use the word I, like this is his own like journal entry that we're reading. Take a look. It says, early the following spring, in the month of Nisan, during the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was serving the king his wine. I had never before appeared sad in his presence, so the king asked me, why are you looking so sad? You don't look sick to me. You must be deeply troubled. Then I was terrified, but I replied, long live the king. How can I not be sad? For the city where my ancestors are buried is in ruins, and the gates have been destroyed by fire. The king asked, well, how can I help you? With a prayer to the God of heaven. Really quick, how many of you have done that before? You're in a situation like, oh God, please help me. Please help me say the right thing in this moment, right? So with a prayer to the God of heaven, I replied, if it please the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried. The king with the queen sitting beside him asked, how long will you be gone? When will you return? After I told him how long I would be gone, the king agreed to my request. And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, great, like go Nehemiah, get out of there, stop talking, leave the room, go, he just gave you whatever you needed, just move, right? Like that's the thing that we get, but Nehemiah says, nope, not done yet. I've got more to ask of the king. There's more, there's another ask here. So he doesn't just ask for permission, he asks the king for his support. Check it out, he says this, he says, I also said to the king, like, this is the king, guys, he could behead him, he's asking a lot. I also said to the king, if it please the king, let me have letters addressed to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River, instructing them to let me travel safely through their territories on my way to Judah. And please give me a letter addressed to Asaph, the manager of the king's forest, instructing him to give me timber. I will need it to make beams for the gates of the temple fortress, for the city walls, and for the house for myself. And the king granted these requests because the gracious hand of God was on me. That's incredible. Like, that's absurd. Like, he not only gets permission, he gets the supplies paid for by the king. He says, yes, I'll do that. Plus, I'll do even more, because we find out in the next verses that he not only does that, he sends with Nehemiah armored guards, like soldiers, to go and protect him so he gets there safely. Why? Because the gracious hand of God was on him. So here's where we've gotten ourselves to this morning as we're looking through Nehemiah and looking for these principles of how to build something well. Whatever it is, here are your action steps. The principles found in Nehemiah, the very first one is this. It starts with something you can't look away from. That's critical. It has to start with something like that. The next step is this. Possibilities emerge with serious prayer. It looks like you're doing nothing, but you're really doing one of the most important first steps. Number 3, it takes shape with faith-filled risk. Can't do anything meaningful unless you're willing to take a jump, unless you're willing to take a risk. You need to step and do what God's calling you to do. Now, most of us, as we're reading through this, we're thinking to ourselves, we'd love for the story to end now. Like this just happens, everything's smooth sailing, all goes well. It's rarely how the story ends. And this is no exception. The story doesn't end here. Don't think for a second that it's going to be easy. It's rarely easy. Just because God's hand is on you, just because you're seeing signs of God providing, doesn't mean it's suddenly going to be a cakewalk. That's not the case. When you're building something well, you will experience resistance. You have to be so convinced that God wants you moving forward that you're willing to face the resistance head on. It didn't take long for Nehemiah to experience some resistance. He goes ahead, he makes the trip, he gets the supplies he needed, but then on the eve of the meeting that he was going to have with the current leaders of Jerusalem, he goes to see the wall for himself. And if you've ever done a project, you know how it goes where like maybe you have a contractor working on something or you're working on it for something yourself, and like you open up a wall or something, and there's these few words you just don't want to hear. Like you find out there's a problem, and they go in and they investigate, and they say these really interesting words. It's worse than we thought. How many of you have experienced it's worse than we thought? It's tough, right? It's a hard set of phrases to listen to hear. But that's real, that's normal. As we're walking through it, as Nehemiah is walking through it, he's on his donkey, he's surveying it the night before, and literally the donkey can't get over the rubble, it's so bad. He has to get off of it, go in and like boulder through the remains of the wall himself to really see the scope of it. If you've ever done a project, you know that sometimes you get those words, it's worse than we thought. Not only are the walls in bad shape, there are enemies waiting for an opportunity to do even more harm to the city and its people. This was called a reality check. We get those sometimes in life, don't we? Nothing is ever as easy as it seems, but it doesn't discourage Nehemiah. It actually makes the opportunity more stark. So the next morning, he gathers all the leaders, stands in front of them, and he says these words. It says, "But now I said to them, you know very well what trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and end this disgrace." Then I told them about how the gracious hand of God had been on me and about my conversation with the king. Notice what he does. He states the problem. Everybody can see it. Everybody's there. But he defines reality, and nobody's going to argue with him. He gets everybody to agree that this is how things are. Here we are. This is reality. Then he reminds them of something incredibly important. We're not fighting this battle. It's not us. We're not building this wall. If this wall gets built, it's God who does it. If God's not in this, we won't be successful. But if he is, then we will be certain to accomplish this task. When you're building something well, it starts with something you can't look away from. Possibilities emerge with serious prayer. It takes shape with faith-filled risk. And then finally, the building starts when the call to action is shared. We can't do things on our own. It's not for our shoulders alone to carry these burdens. It's for us to do together and for God to work through us together. And here's how they respond. They hear Nehemiah's speech and they replied at once, "Yes, let's rebuild the wall." So they began the good work. All week, it's been really hard for me not to just draw direct parallels between the story of Nehemiah and what we've experienced as a church moving into a new space these past few months. I mean, there's so many things that parallel that it's just hard to not just make that direct comparison. God has been incredibly good to us every step of this building project so far. It's been incredible. But it's about so much more than walls. The part I don't want to forget, the part we can't forget, is the very thing you can't look away from. The thing that keeps you up at night, reminding you that you have to do something about it. It's your why. That's what the thing that you can't look away from really is. It's why you're doing what you're doing. This past week, I was talking to our RCC Kids Director, Teresa Hacker. She's amazing. She does incredible work. But we were just talking, we're drilling down like, hey, why do we do kids ministry? Like, why are we doing this in the first, what's the purpose of it? And we're kind of talking through the different things, and we're saying, hey, it's not just to have kids have fun. They have a ton of fun. There are high school students that meet with all the kids. They do tug of war. That's it. That's the word. And just wrestling, all kinds of silly stuff. They have a ton of fun, but that's not why we do it. It's also not to get kids to memorize a bunch of Bible verses. And you'd think that'd be it, but that's not the purpose. We do a whole bunch of Bible teaching to have those verses rattling around their heads, but that's not why either. It's also not to give parents that hour of free babysitting, though that is amazing. When you first experience it, oh man, it was so good. It's not for that either. We do RCC Kids the way we do it because we're preparing our kids to navigate this shifting world so they can represent Jesus well. That's why we do it. That's our why. That's the thing we can't look away from. I mean, if you haven't noticed, our world doesn't stop shifting right, then left, up and down, teetering this way and then flailing that way. That's our world right now. If there's ever been our time when our kids, when our students, when our families need something solid to stand on, it's now. And when we provide that, when we as a church family pursue that solid foundation, that solid identity that comes from Jesus, that's when we're doing something substantial about the thing we can't look away from. That's when our community grows healthier, this church family grows healthier. It's why building this church family matters so much, brick by brick, person by person, child by child. This principle is the foundation of everything we do, the big things and the small things. I mean, it was neat. A while back, I was talking with that doctor and talking about how these nurses are just running themselves ragged. And it was exhausted, right? And we have to do something. And so we got together and the church did this really cool thing where we stocked their break rooms with really healthy, good food. Not pizza and donuts, I mean, that's fine, but I can't run on that, right? So we gave them all kinds of really great stuff to stock their break rooms for the hospitals in the area, and they were so grateful. It was awesome. It was a small thing in the grand scheme of things. They're running ragged. It was a small way to appreciate them. But it was amazing just to be able to do something. It was so much fun, and we got to make a small impact on something we couldn't look away from. But here's the thing about this church. About this church family. It's all fine and fun to organize things once in a while where it's RCC, in quotes, doing it. But you know what's even better? You know what's even better than that? It's when we grow this church family so full of people who are doing their best to represent Jesus well that whenever the 1,000 or so people who call this church their home see something they can't look away from, they do something. They do something about it. Small or big, we care for people. We share the hope we found in Jesus. We're building that kind of church, brick by brick, person by person, student by student, child by child. We're not building a building for the sake of a nice place to gather. We're building a church family that this community and beyond can't help but be grateful for because we are eager for God to use us to provide a firm foundation that meets the needs of others and meets the needs that others choose to look away from, but we don't. Yes, we're going to meet the physical needs. Yeah, we're going to meet emotional needs, but most of all, we're going to meet the needs that we are all desperate for, a relationship with God through the love that he gives to us through Jesus. We're building a church family that chooses to represent Jesus well because we've experienced God's love through Jesus and we can't hide it. We have to share it. We have to build from it. If you're going to build something well, build it like Nehemiah did. Starts with something you can't look away from. Possibilities emerge with serious prayer. It takes shape with faith-filled risk, and the building starts when the call to action is shared. Here's my challenge. Pick one of those this week and take the step. Maybe it's to actually look at the thing you've chosen to look away from, but you shouldn't have. To see it for what it is, the struggle. Maybe it's to do some serious prayer about it. See what God wants you to do about it. Maybe it's to take a leap. You know, you've just been waiting, and it's to actually take that step of faith. Or maybe it's to invite some other people to do it with you, because God never meant for you to do it alone. I'm going to say a prayer. I'm going to ask God to help us do one of those steps this week so we could represent Jesus well as a church. Would you pray with me? Dear God, thank you that you love us so much that you give us these pictures of how to follow you well and how to build something well. This week, God, we are asking you for your direction, for your courage, that we might not look away, that we could see squarely the thing that we can't look away from, that you won't let us look away from. And then, God, that you would give us the ability to pray seriously about it, to see what you want us to do about it. And then, God, we